Come in from wherever you have been today, and let the evening settle around you like a blanket pulled up to the chin. There is a fire burning somewhere far behind us in time, and tonight I want to sit with you beside it because the story it holds is older than any story you have ever been told, and it deserves to be heard slowly the way it actually happened. Here is the truth I want you to carry with you into this night. There was a moment deep in our past when the entire human species came within a hair's breadth of disappearing completely. Not a war, not an invasion. Something quieter and far more dangerous, a slow closing door that very nearly shut on all of us before history had even begun to notice we were here. For 250,000 years before anyone built a city or planted a field or wrote a single word, human beings had to answer one question over and over every single day with no guarantee of the right answer. How do we live through this? Picture a woman crouched at the edge of a small fire somewhere on the coast of what will one day be called Southern Africa. It is night and the wind off the ocean carries salt and cold into the shelter of rock where her people have gathered. She is perhaps 20 years old, though no one is counting years the way we count them now. Her hands are cracked from days spent digging shellfish out of tide pools, one of the only reliable meals left after a season of failed hunts. Beside her, a child sleeps fitfully thin in a way that frightens her more than she lets herself say aloud. The group around this fire numbers perhaps 30 people. Somewhere beyond the firelight, a larger predator moves through the dark, unseen, but not unheard, and she listens with the part of her mind that never fully rests. She does not know that she is living through what researchers will one day call one of the great bottlenecks of human survival. She only knows that tomorrow again they must find food or they will not. There is something almost impossible to hold in the mind about that scene, and it is this. Genetic evidence gathered from populations alive today suggests that at certain points in that deep past, the entire breeding population of our species may have shrunk to a number small enough to fit inside a single modern neighborhood, not thousands scattered across a continent. A number closer to the population of a small town clinging to survival in isolated pockets of Africa, while the rest of the world sat empty of anyone like us at all. And here is the second thing worth sitting with tonight. We were not alone in that world. Other kinds of humans walked the same earth during those centuries, different enough from us to be their own separate branches of the family tree. And for a long stretch of time, nobody could have said with any certainty which branch, if any, would still exist 10,000 years later. Before we go further into all of this, if the kind of history that gets told slowly and honestly is something you have been looking for, take a moment to press subscribe and leave the video a like. It helps more than you might think, and it means these stories keep finding the people who actually want to hear them. I would love to know in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight and what first drew you to a story like this one. Now let yourself get comfortable, because we have a long way to travel together and there is no need to rush any of it. The woman at that fire could not have known what her life would come to mean. She was not thinking about the species. She was thinking about the child beside her, about the tide tables, about whether the meat from yesterday's hunt would last another 2 days. And that more than anything else is the doorway into this story. Because for almost the entire span of time that modern humans have existed on this earth, life was not organized around kingdoms or writing systems or grand ambitions. It was organized around exactly what she was thinking about that night. Warmth, food, the people close enough to keep you alive. Everything else that we now associate with being human language, art, belief, the reach for meaning beyond mere survival, all of it had to be built slowly inside lives that were shaped first and constantly by scarcity. It is worth pausing here to say something plainly, because it changes how the rest of this story should be heard. The period we are about to walk through together, roughly 250,000 years, is not a prologue to human history. It is the overwhelming majority of it. If you compress the entire existence of our species into a single day, the invention of farming would not arrive until the very last 20 minutes before midnight, and everything you might think of as civilization, cities, empires, written law would be crowded into the final few minutes after that. Nearly the whole day from the first grey light of morning until deep into the night belongs to people like the woman on that coastline. People who left behind no monuments, no names we will ever know, and yet who did something monumental anyway. They kept the thread unbroken, because it raises an uncomfortable question that still does not have a clean answer. What allowed one kind of human being to endure 250,000 years of hardship, migration and near collapse, while others in many ways just as capable did not? To understand how anyone survived those 250,000 years, it helps to first understand the stage they were standing on, because it was not one continent behaves the same way for all that time. It shifted beneath their feet quite literally again and again. Africa during the era we are speaking of was not the single unbroken landscape people sometimes imagine when they picture the birthplace of our species. It was a patchwork of wildly different worlds pressed together across one continent. Vast deserts that could kill a person in a single unlucky afternoon sat within a few 100 miles of lush river valleys thick with game. Mountain highlands held on to cooler, wetter climates, while the lowlands around them baked and cracked, and every few thousand years, sometimes every few centuries, that map redrew itself. Rainfall belts moved, rivers that had run for generations dried into memory, grasslands that had fed enormous herds of antelope and buffalo gave way to sand within a human lifetime. The earliest populations of our species were not living in a stable garden. They were living on a continent that kept renegotiating the terms of survival, and every group had to be ready to move, adapt, or vanish along with whatever had sustained them. This matters enormously for what comes next in our story, because it means that from the very beginning human beings were not a single population quietly growing in one place. They were a scattering of small, often isolated groups separated by deserts and mountain ranges that could remain impassable for centuries at a time. Genetic research done in recent decades has revealed something that would have surprised earlier generations of scientists, which is that some of these separated populations may have gone tens of thousands of years with little to no contact with one another, evolving in slight isolation before climate shifts opened corridors that let them meet, mix, and share knowledge again. The most widely accepted reconstruction holds that the deep ancestry of every person alive today traces back not to one single group in one single place, but to a web of populations scattered across Africa, sometimes drifting apart, sometimes drawn back together by a rain, and they were not the only humans on that stage. This is the detail that tends to surprise people the most when they first encounter it, because most of us grow up with a simple picture of human evolution, a straight line moving steadily upward toward us. The reality those first Homo sapiens actually lived inside was far stranger and far more crowded. In parts of Europe and Western Asia, the Neanderthals had already been established for well over 100,000 years. Thick-boned, powerfully built expert hunters of large game with brains on average, slightly larger than our own. Further east in the caves of Siberia, a population scientists now call the Denisovans left behind little more than a few fragments of bone and teeth, and yet those fragments carried enough genetic information to prove they were a distinct branch of humanity entirely, one that modern researchers only confirmed existed as recently as 2010. And in a cave system in South Africa, bones belonging to a strange small-brained, small-bodied species now called Homo naledi suggest that even within Africa itself, our ancestors may have shared their landscape with human relatives so different from us that early researchers debated for months whether the bones even belonged to the same broader family tree. Sit with that for a moment, because it changes the emotional shape of this story. For much of those 250,000 years being human did not mean being alone in the world as the only thinking tool, making fire-tending creature walking upright across the land. It meant being one kind of human among several, none of them certain which of them, if any, would still be walking that land when the ice finally receded for good. What set our particular branch apart in those earliest centuries was not size or strength. Homo sapiens were not the largest or the strongest human species sharing the earth. What set them apart, according to the evidence gathered from sites scattered across the African continent, was something quieter and harder to see in a fossil, which is flexibility. The archaeological record from this period, particularly from sites like Pinnacle Point along the southern African coast, shows people adapting their diet with remarkable speed to whatever a punishing landscape offered. When large game grew scarce, they turned to the tide pools, learning to read the rhythms of the ocean well enough to harvest shellfish on a predictable schedule, one of the earliest known examples of humans systematically exploiting a marine food source. When plant life shifted, they learned which roots could be dug and roasted to unlock nutrients the raw plant would not give up. This was not a species locked into one way of living. It was a species that kept quietly rewriting its own rulebook generation after generation, whenever the old rules stopped working. There is a particular kind of evidence from this era that tends to stop people in their tracks the first time they hear about it, and it has nothing to do with tools or bones. In a cave called Blombos along that same southern African coastline, researchers uncovered a piece of ochre stone deliberately engraved with a cross-hatched geometric pattern dated to roughly 73,000 years ago. It is, as far as the current evidence shows, one of the oldest known examples of a human being creating an abstract design with apparent intention, a mark that served no obvious practical purpose beyond meaning something to the person who carved it. Nearby, in the same layers of sediment, archaeologists found shell beads pierced and strung worn as personal ornaments, along with evidence of a workshop for mixing pigment, essentially an early paint production site, tens of thousands of years before anything resembling a settled village existed anywhere on Earth. Scholars still debate exactly what these objects meant to the people who made them, whether they carried social status, spiritual significance, or something closer to simple decoration. And the honest answer is that we may never fully know, but their existence tells us something the bones alone cannot, which is that the inner life of these people, their capacity for abstraction, for beauty, for meaning beyond survival, was already present, quietly asserting itself even inside lives dominated by hunger and hardship. It would be easy, hearing all of this, to imagine these early populations as small and struggling everywhere all the time. That would not be entirely accurate either. The evidence suggests a rhythm to their existence, seasons of relative abundance when rain fell reliably, and herds moved through familiar territory followed by seasons and sometimes decades of real scarcity when everything they depended on thinned or disappeared. A person born during one of the good stretches might live an entire childhood believing the world was generous. A person born 20 years later into a dry cycle might never know that generosity at all. This unevenness, this constant unpredictability is part of what shaped the deep instincts every human being still carries today. The wariness around scarcity, the impulse to store and share food within a trusted group, the deep social bonds that meant the difference between eating and starving when the environment turned against you. And it is worth saying plainly here that cooperation, not competition, appears again and again in the archaeological record as the real engine behind survival during this era. Sites show evidence of food sharing across a group even when resources were thin of injured or aging individuals being cared for well past the point where they could contribute physical labor of knowledge about which plants healed and which poisoned, about where water could be found in a dry season, being passed carefully from older members of a group to younger ones. In a world with no written record, no accumulated library of human knowledge, the elders of a small band were in a very real sense the only archive that existed. Losing one of them to hardship did not just mean losing a person. It meant losing a piece of accumulated understanding that might never be recovered. This is the world, then, that the woman from that fire on the coastline belonged to. Not a simple static existence, but a shifting, uncertain landscape shared with other kinds of humans, shaped by a climate that offered no promises, softened only by the fierce loyalty small groups of people learned to hold for one another, because nothing else could be relied upon. It was a world already quietly being changed by the human minds, by ochre and shell beads and the first stirrings of symbolic thought, even as the human body kept fighting simply to be fed. But flexibility and cooperation, as remarkable as they were, would soon be tested by something far larger than a dry season or a lean year. Somewhere out past the horizon of this early world, a force was gathering that had nothing to do with the choices any person or group could make. And when it arrived, it would not ask whether a population was clever or close-knit or well-adapted. It would simply arrive, and the answer to what came next would depend on something closer to chance than to any skill our ancestors had spent generations perfecting. There is a kind of evolution that leaves no bones behind at all, and it may be the most important kind that happened during this era. It lives instead in the sharpened edge of a stone in the length of a spear shaft, in the particular way a fire was banked to survive the night. And somewhere across the long uneven centuries following those first stirrings of symbolic thought, human beings began quietly rewriting not just what they believed, but how they made things, and that shift would prove just as essential to their survival as anything etched into ochre. The tools our ancestors carried during the earliest part of this story were by later standards fairly simple. Sharp-edged flakes struck from a stone core, useful for cutting hide and butchering meat, effective enough but limited. What archaeologists find layered into cave floors across southern and eastern Africa, dating from roughly 100,000 years ago onward, tells a different story, one of steady, deliberate refinement. At a site called Sibudu, in what is now for South Africa, researchers uncovered evidence of a technique called heat treatment, where certain types of stone were deliberately baked in a controlled fire before being worked, a process that changes the internal structure of the material and makes it far easier to shape into a fine, sharp edge. This was not an accident. Producing that effect requires understanding fire well enough to control its temperature over time, and repeating a process precisely enough that it becomes reliable rather than a lucky occurrence. Somewhere in those cave-dwelling communities, someone figured this out, taught it to others, and it spread widely enough to appear at sites hundreds of miles apart. Around this same broad window of time, the shape of human hunting itself begins to change in the archaeological record. Small, carefully worked stone points, some no larger than a fingernail, start turning up in numbers that suggest something significant. Their size and shape closely match what would be needed for the tips of arrows, and if the interpretation holds, and many researchers now believe it does, it would place the invention of the bow and arrow far earlier than once assumed. Perhaps by 70,000 years or more, a bow changes everything about how a small, physically vulnerable group of people relates to a landscape full of animals that could kill them. It allows a hunter to strike from a distance to bring down prey, without the desperate closeness of hand-to-hand confrontation with an animal several times their size. It is a technology born entirely out of necessity, refined slowly by people who could not afford too many mistakes, because a mistake in that world so often meant an empty stomach or worse. What strikes many researchers looking back at this stretch of the archaeological record is not any single invention, but the pattern underneath all of them. Knowledge was not appearing and disappearing in isolated flashes, it was accumulating. A technique discovered by one small group in one particular valley was somehow finding its way to other groups, sometimes separated by considerable distance, and being preserved well enough to be improved upon by later generations. This suggests something about the social world these people were building that goes well beyond simple survival instinct. It suggests networks, contact between groups that were not the same immediate family exchanges of ideas, and very likely exchanges of people as young men and women moved between bands to find partners outside their own small circle, carrying knowledge and technique along with them as they went. There is a particular category of evidence that makes this idea of far-reaching contact especially vivid, and it involves a material called obsidian, a naturally occurring volcanic glass prized in the ancient world for the extraordinarily sharp edge it can hold. Obsidian only forms near specific volcanic sources, which means archaeologists can often trace a single obsidian tool back to the exact outcrop of rock it came from, sometimes using nothing more than the particular chemical signature locked inside the stone. When researchers have done this work at sites in Eastern Africa, the results have been startling. Obsidian tools have turned up well over 100 miles from their geological source, in some cases considerably farther. That distance did not happen because one person walked that entire journey alone with a piece of rock in hand. It reflects something more remarkable, a chain of contact and exchange stretching between groups who may never have met the original source community at all, passing material, and with it presumably information hand-to-hand across a landscape that modern people might assume was empty and disconnected. It's worth pausing on how strange and moving this actually is once you sit with it. These were not isolated bands stumbling blindly through an empty world. They were in a very real, if primitive sense, connected. Somewhere in these overlapping social webs, ideas about technology, about which routes were safe to travel, about where water could reliably be found even in a dry season, were moving through the population like a slow, steady current. Carried by people who had no way of knowing, they were building something that would eventually make it possible for their descendants to walk out of Africa entirely and into every corner of the globe. None of this technological and social growth happened evenly. And it is important to say that plainly, because it would be easy to imagine a tidy, steady climb from simple to sophisticated, the evidence does not support that picture. Sites show periods of remarkable innovation, followed by long stretches where the archaeological record goes strangely quiet, techniques that appear, flourish for a time and then seem to vanish from the record entirely, only for something similar to reappear thousands of years later in a different location. Scholars still debate what these gaps actually mean. Some argue that certain innovations were lost when the small populations who held that knowledge died out or were absorbed into other groups, taking specialized skills with them into extinction long before the species itself faced any such threat. Others argue that the gaps say more about the patchiness of the archaeological record itself, the accident of which caves happened to preserve evidence and which did not, rather than any true interruption in the human ingenuity. The honest answer is that we may be seeing a mixture of both, and the evidence layered thin across tens of thousands of years does not yet allow anyone to say with full confidence which explanation fits which particular gap. What this uneven, flickering pattern does tell us, though, is something quietly important about how fragile knowledge can be when it exists only inside living. Human minds passed from an elder to a child by voice and demonstration, with no way to write it down or preserve it beyond the memory of the people who carried it. A single hard winter, a disease that swept through a small band, a conflict that scattered a group before the necessary lessons were passed on fully. Any of these could erase decades or centuries of accumulated understanding in the space of a single generation, and when it was lost, it might take another few thousand years and no small measure of luck for another small group somewhere else to rediscover the same idea independently. Progress during this era was not a straight line moving steadily forward. It was closer to a slow tide rising and receding, occasionally pulling back further than anyone watching it would have expected, and yet across all of that unevenness something durable was clearly taking shape underneath it, something visible not in any one invention, but in the accumulating weight of all of them together. These small bands, rarely numbering more than a few dozen people at a time, scattered across a continent that could turn hostile without warning, were developing the beginnings of a shared human toolkit, technological and social both, sophisticated enough that when the moment eventually came to leave the only landscape their ancestors had ever known, they would not be walking into the unknown entirely empty-handed. They would be carrying fire-making skill, refined over countless generations, hunting technology capable of bringing down animals from a careful distance, social bonds strong enough to hold a group together through famine and networks of contact and exchange that had already proven again and again their quiet power to move both material and knowledge across enormous distances. There is a temptation hearing all of this to imagine that everything was now in place, that the hardest part of the story was somehow already behind these people. It would be comforting to think so, but the landscape that shaped them, so far unpredictable as it had been, was still relatively familiar, still in its own harsh way, a landscape their bodies and instincts had been tuned to for a very long time. What waited beyond the edge of that world, in the deserts and coastlines and unfamiliar climates that stretched out past the borders of everything their ancestors had ever known, would ask something different of them entirely, and there would be no gentle way to find out whether they were ready. Every family has a moment when someone finally walks out the door for good, and for the human family that moment did not happen once. It happened in waves over tens of thousands of years, in fits and starts that included failure as often as success. And the story of how our ancestors finally spread beyond the continent that made them is far messier and far more human than the simple picture of a single triumphant march out of Africa that many of us grew up with. The earliest known attempt shows up in the fossil record far sooner than most people expect. At two sites in what is now Israel called Skul and Kafzeh, researchers have uncovered the remains of anatomically modern humans dated to roughly 100,000 years ago, buried with what appears to be deliberate care. One skeleton found cradled with the jaw of a wild boar resting against the chest. For a long while, this discovery puzzled scientists because the genetic and archaeological evidence surrounding it suggested something unexpected. This early population does not appear to be the ancestor of the people who live in that region or almost anywhere else today. The most widely accepted reconstruction now holds that this was an early outward push that simply did not take. These people or their descendants seem to have vanished from the wider genetic record, possibly pushed back into Africa or wiped out entirely by a returning ice age, by competition with Neanderthal groups already well established in the region, or by some combination the evidence cannot yet fully untangle. It is a sobering thing to consider. An entire community walking confidently into a new world, leaving behind graves that show real tenderness toward their dead, and simply not surviving long enough to become anyone's ancestor at all. The migration that did eventually succeed the one whose genetic echo lives in nearly every person alive today outside of Africa appears to have begun sometime between 70,000 and 60,000 years ago, and it likely did not feel to the people living through it like a single grand journey at all. It would have felt like what it probably was, a slow drift of small family groups following coastlines and river valleys, chasing game and fresh water, generation edging past generation, without any single person ever intending to leave their homeland behind forever. One especially important detail, only confirmed by researchers in the last decade or so, involves a stretch of land that today sits almost entirely underwater, the shallow sea floor of the southern Red Sea. During periods of intense global cooling, so much of the planet's water became locked into glacial ice, that sea levels drop dramatically and at its narrowest point. The crossing between Africa and Arabia may have shrunk to a strait only a few miles wide, with a chain of islands offering resting points along the way. It was likely walkable, or nearly so, during the driest, coldest stretches of that era. A journey that today would require a boat and open ocean navigation may once have been, for a brief window of time, barely more than a long wade through shallow water. What waited on the other side surprises many people the first time they hear about it, because Arabia, one of the driest, harshest regions on the planet today, was not always this way. Evidence gathered from an ancient lake bed at a site called Al-Wusta, deep in what is now the Nafud Desert of Saudi Arabia, tells a strikingly different story. Researchers working there uncovered a human finger bone dated to roughly 90,000 years old, alongside the fossilized remains of hippopotamuses and freshwater fish. Hippopotamuses, in the middle of what is today one of the most punishing deserts on Earth. During certain windows of this era, shifts in monsoon patterns turned huge stretches of Arabia green, filling ancient lake basins and river channels that today exist only as dry, ghostly outlines visible from satellite images. Human groups appear to have moved into this temporarily lush landscape, opportunistically following the rain, only to be forced to retreat, migrate further, or perish when the rains inevitably failed again and the desert reclaimed what it had briefly given up. This pattern of temporary green corridors opening and closing across otherwise hostile terrain appears to have shaped the entire outward spread of our species far more than any single deliberate decision to explore new lands. Human groups were not explorers in the way we might romantically imagine, driven by curiosity about what lay over the next horizon. They were more often simply following the food and water that a shifting climate offered, and withdrew generation after generation until those slow opportunistic movements had, almost without any of them realizing it, carried their descendants thousands of miles from where their story had begun. From that Arabian gateway, the paths our ancestors took begin to fan out in directions that still leave researchers debating exact timelines and exact routes. Scholars still disagree about how many separate waves of migration there were, whether an earlier population that pushed into southern Asia contributed meaningfully to later populations, or whether it too, like the group at school in Kafze, largely died out and was replaced. The genetic and fossil evidence, gathered from scattered sites across an enormous geographic range, remains incomplete enough that firm answers on this particular question are still being argued over in academic journals today. What is clearer is the astonishing range these movements eventually covered. Within what is, on an evolutionary timescale, an almost impossibly short span, human populations appear along the southern coast of Asia, push north into the colder river valleys of what is now China, and eventually reach the edge of a body of water that would require something no human group had ever needed before. Because somewhere around 65,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years, depending on which dating method a researcher trusts, most human beings did something that should, by any reasonable measure, have been impossible for a species with no metal tools and no prior tradition of long-distance sailing. They reached Australia, even during the depths of the Ice Age, when sea levels dropped low enough to connect many land masses that are separate today. Australia remained isolated behind open ocean, a stretch of water that even at its narrowest crossing points would have required a journey of many miles with no land visible on the horizon for a significant portion of it. And yet the archaeological evidence at sites like Majed Bibe, in what is now the Northern Territory of Australia, shows unmistakable signs of human presence by this astonishingly earlier date. Tools, ground pigment, and evidence of controlled use of fire, all found beneath layers of sediment that have been dated with increasing confidence in recent years. How did they do it? The honest answer is that nobody knows for certain. There is no surviving record of the vessels they might have used, no description of the journey itself. The evidence remains incomplete, and what researchers can say with confidence is limited mostly to the fact that it happened, not precisely how. What can be inferred is that this required not luck alone but planning. A group large enough to found a new population carrying with them the knowledge and supplies needed to survive an ocean crossing into a land whose plants, animals and dangers would have been entirely unfamiliar on arrival. There is something worth sitting with in that image. A small group of people deliberately pushing a raft or simple boat out onto open water toward a horizon with nothing visible beyond it, trusting a plan built on guesswork and hope rather than any certainty that land existed at all. It reframes the quiet courage of this era in a way that pure survival struggle sometimes does not. These were not merely people enduring hardship as it came to them. Some among them appear to have gone looking for new hardship, deliberately driven by something that looks, even across 65,000 years of distance, remarkably like hope. Not every migration during this era carried people toward warmth and abundance either. As some groups pushed east along southern coastlines, others turned north into landscapes growing steadily colder, drier, and less forgiving, with every generation chasing herds of large game into the territory where a single hard winter could undo years of careful survival in a matter of weeks. Their story and the particular cruelty and ingenuity that colder world demanded of them would ask something different of these wandering descendants than anything the warmer landscapes behind them ever had. Cold has its own kind of intelligence, and the human beings who followed herds of reindeer and mammoth into the northern reaches of Europe and Asia were, without quite knowing it, being tutored by one of the harshest teachers our species has ever faced. Every mistake in that world carried a penalty measured not in hunger alone, but in frostbite in fingers and toes lost to a night without adequate shelter, in the particular arithmetic of survival where a single miscalculation about how much fuel a fire would need before dawn could be fatal by morning. The archaeological sites left behind by these northern populations tell a story of adaptation so thorough it is almost difficult to reconcile with the equatorial origins of the species making it. At sites across what is now Ukraine and Russia, researchers have uncovered the remains of dwellings built not from wood, which the open steppe offered in only limited supply, but from the bones of woolly mammoths. Thick leg bones and curved tusks arranged deliberately into circular or oval frameworks, likely covered with hide to create shelter against wind that could otherwise strip warmth from a body in minutes. One such structure at a site called Mejirich, believed to date back roughly 15,000 years, was built using the bones of an estimated 95 individual mammoths, a staggering figure that raises its own quiet question. It suggests either an enormous sustained hunting effort by a single group, or, as some researchers now believe is more likely, the patient scavenging of bones from animals that had already died from other causes over a period of years, carefully collected and stored until enough material had accumulated to build with. Either explanation points toward the same underlying truth. These were people thinking in seasons and years, not days, planning for a winter that had not yet arrived, using resources gathered long before they were needed. Clothing in this northern world stopped being optional decoration and became a matter of life and death in a way it had never quite been in the warmer landscapes their ancestors left behind. Ordinary hide draped loosely over the body, sufficient in milder climates, would not hold enough warmth against Ice Age winds that could drop temperatures far below anything experienced across most of human history up to that point. And here the evidence offers something genuinely surprising, found not in cloth itself, which almost never survives tens of thousands of years, but in a far more delicate and unexpected source. Researchers studying ancient DNA and the genetics of a particular species of louse, the kind that lives specifically in clothing rather than on skin or in hair, have used the evolutionary divergence of that insect to estimate roughly when humans began regularly wearing fitted sewn garments rather than simple draped hides. Their estimates place this shift at somewhere between 170,000 years ago, considerably earlier than many researchers once assumed, suggesting that the technology of true tailored clothing needles, sinew, thread, carefully fitted seams had already been developing quietly for a very long time, before these northern populations ever needed to rely on it for their very survival. Bone needles with eyes fine enough to thread with sinew have been recovered from sites dating back over 40,000 years, small unassuming objects that nonetheless represent one of the quiet turning points that made survival at these latitudes possible at all. It would be a mistake, though, to imagine that skill and preparation alone made this world safe, because nothing about the deep past ever offered that kind of guarantee. And the northern populations who mastered mammoth bone architecture and needle and thread were, without any way of knowing it, living on borrowed time relative to a threat gathering far to the south, one that had nothing to do with cold at all. Sometime around 74,000 years ago on the island now called Sumatra, a volcano erupted with a violence that modern geologists still struggle to fully convey in terms an ordinary person can easily picture. The eruption at what is today known as Lake Toba is classified as a supervolcanic event, a category so far beyond ordinary volcanic activity that comparisons to historical eruptions people might be familiar with, even devastating ones, fall short of capturing its true scale. Ash from the eruption has been found in sediment layers as far away as the Arabian Sea and the South China Sea, and some estimates suggest the eruption ejected enough volcanic material to blanket significant portions of South Asia in a layer of ash measured not in inches but in feet. For years, the most striking claim connected to this eruption was what became known as the Toba catastrophe theory, the idea that the volcanic winter following the eruption's sulfur and ash, thrown high into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and dropping global temperatures for years afterward, triggered a genetic bottleneck so severe that the entire human species was pushed to the very edge of extinction, its population reduced, according to some early genetic estimates, to perhaps as few as a few thousand breeding individuals scattered across the globe. It is a haunting idea, and for a while it shaped how many researchers and much of the public understood this entire era, a single cataclysmic near miss that very nearly ended everything. The evidence today, however, tells a more complicated and honestly more interesting story, and scholars still actively debate exactly how severe the Toba event's impact on human populations truly was. More recent archaeological work has complicated the simple catastrophe narrative considerably. At a site in southern India called Jwalapuram, researchers have found stone tools in sediment layers both directly above and directly below the distinctive ash layer left by the Toba eruption, and the tools on either side appear remarkably similar in style and technique. This suggests to many researchers now working on the question that at least some human populations in that region survived the eruption and its aftermath without the kind of total cultural collapse a species pushed to the very brink of extinction might be expected to show. Ice core data from Greenland, meanwhile, while confirming that Toba did cause real and measurable global cooling, suggests the effect, though severe, may have been somewhat shorter and less extreme than the most dramatic early volcanic winter estimates once proposed. What almost certainly did happen, and what the genetic record does still support even under this more nuanced picture, is that human populations during this general era, whether from Toba specifically or from the broader pattern of climate instability that defined this entire stretch of prehistory, did pass through a period of serious genetic bottlenecking. Studies of genetic diversity across modern human populations consistently point to a reduction in effective population size at some point within this rough window. Evidence still visible today in the comparatively low genetic diversity of our species relative to many other primates, with far smaller total populations but far deeper genetic variation, a signature consistent with a population that once shrank dramatically before expanding again. Whether Toba was the single dramatic trigger of that bottleneck one contributing factor among several intersecting climate crises, or largely a coincidence in timing with a decline already underway? For other reasons, remains one of the genuinely open questions in this field, and researchers studying ice cores, ash layers, and ancient genomes continue to refine the picture as new evidence comes to light. What can be said with real confidence is this. Somewhere in this era, our species passed through a genuine narrowing, a period when the total number of people carrying the particular combination of traits that would eventually become every human being alive today may have been small enough that the loss of even a handful of small bands to hunger to cold, to the simple bad luck of choosing the wrong valley to shelter in during a hard year, could plausibly have ended the entire project of human existence before it had properly begun. Is it strange to think that every person listening to this tonight, every family line stretching back through every culture and continent, may trace back through a bottleneck that narrow? It is one of those facts that resists being fully absorbed the first time it is heard, and perhaps it should. There is something almost vertiginous about standing this close to a near ending that never quite arrived, and yet it did not arrive. Whatever combination of shelter cooperation, accumulated knowledge, and plain fortune carried these scattered populations through that narrow passage, carried them through it well enough that their descendants would go on in the centuries that followed, to spread further and adapt more completely than at any point before. The northern hunters building shelters from mammoth bone, the coastal foragers still gathering shellfish along familiar shores, the small bands who had crossed into Arabia, and beyond all of them in their own scattered, disconnected corners of the world, were quietly proving something about resilience that no single group among them could have understood at the time. But surviving a bottleneck is never the same as being safe afterward, and the climate that had already tested them so severely was not finished testing them yet. Something colder, longer, and in its own way more relentless than any single volcanic winter was still gathering on the horizon, and it would demand an entirely different kind of endurance than anything these people had faced before. Somewhere around 26,000 years ago, the slow, uneven cooling that had shaped so much of this story finally reached its most extreme point. A stretch of time researchers now call the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets more than a mile thick spread across huge portions of the northern hemisphere, and the world our ancestors had spent so many generations learning to survive became in certain respects almost unrecognizable even to them. Picture the map of that era, because it looked nothing like the one we carry in our minds today. Britain was not an island, but the frozen western edge of a continuous European landmass. Vast stretches of what is now the North Sea lay exposed as dry wind-scoured tundra. In North America, an ice sheet larger than the entire modern nation of Canada locked away so much of the planet's water that sea levels worldwide sat well over 300 feet lower than they stand now. A detail worth sitting with, because it means that some of the richest, most livable landscapes those Ice Age populations actually inhabited the low-lying coastal plains they would have most preferred to settle. Now rest permanently beneath the waves, an entire layer of human history submerged and largely unrecoverable to archaeologists working today. For the human populations who remained in Europe and Northern Asia through this period rather than retreating south, life narrowed into what researchers sometimes describe as refugia pockets of relatively survivable land, often in sheltered river valleys or along southern coastlines, where enough game and shelter persisted to sustain small communities through the very worst of the cold. One especially significant refuge sat in what is now southwestern France and northern Spain, a region whose limestone caves would go on to preserve some of the most remarkable evidence of the human mind that survived from this entire era. It's worth pausing here on something that tends to surprise people, because the popular image of cave art often centres on a single famous site Lascaux discovered, by 4 teenagers and a dog in 1940, whose painted horses and bulls have become almost a shorthand symbol for prehistoric creativity. But the honest picture is both older and stranger than that single celebrated cave suggests. At Chauvet, also in France, paintings of lions, rhinoceroses and horses, rendered with a technical confidence and subtlety that startled the archaeologists who first documented them, have been dated to roughly 36,000 years ago, meaning these particular images were already older. At the moment Lascaux was painted than Lascaux is old to us today. And further still in the Sulawesi region of Indonesia, a painting depicting what appears to be a hunting scene involving therianthropes figures that blend human and animal features has been dated using uranium series techniques to at least 43,000 years ago, among the oldest known examples of narrative art anywhere on Earth, created by populations entirely separate from the ones painting the caves of France on the opposite side of the planet. What these scattered, independently developed traditions of art suggest more than any single discovery on its own is that something had shifted broadly and almost simultaneously across dispersed human populations in how people were thinking about representation, memory, and meaning. Scholars still debate exactly what drove this apparent flourishing. Some argue it reflects a genuine cognitive threshold, a final refinement in the capacity for abstract, symbolic thought that had been slowly developing since the ochre engravings of Blombos tens of thousands of years earlier. Others argue more cautiously that it may simply reflect what has survived rather than what was created, that similarly sophisticated art may have existed far earlier, on perishable materials, wood, hide, sand that left no trace for us to find, and that stone cave walls simply happened to be one of the only canvases capable of surviving 40,000 years of weather and time. The evidence remains incomplete enough that certainty on this particular question is not really available to anyone. What is not in doubt is what these images meant for the people creating them, at least in the sense of what they required. Reaching some of the painted chambers at Chauvet meant crawling in near total darkness through narrow passages deep enough into the earth that a torch or animal fat lamp would have provided the only light for hours at a time, an act that carried real physical risk with no immediate practical reward, no food gained, no warmth secured. People were doing this anyway, repeatedly across many generations, which suggests these images carried a weight for their creators that went well beyond decoration, touching something closer to ritual memory, or a way of reaching toward meaning that a hard, uncertain world did not otherwise offer. While these southern refugees nurtured what may be the first true flowering of human artistic expression, a different and quieter story was reaching its final chapters not far away, among a population that had shared the European landscape with modern humans for tens of thousands of years already. The Neanderthals, long established, powerfully adapted to cold climate hunting, had endured ice ages before this one, weathering climate extremes for well over 100,000 years before modern humans ever arrived on the continent at all. And yet sometime between roughly 40,000 and 35,000 years ago, in the archaeological layers across their former territory, their distinctive stone tools simply stop appearing. Why this happened remains one of the most genuinely contested questions in the entire field of human origins, and it deserves to be treated with real honesty rather than false certainty. For a long while, the popular explanation leaned heavily toward direct conflict, modern humans arriving and effectively displacing or destroying an older population unable to compete. The current evidence paints something more layered than that simple narrative allows. Genetic studies confirm that modern humans and Neanderthals interbred at multiple points during their long overlap, meaning the boundary between these two populations was never as sharply drawn as the word extinction tends to suggest. Every person of non-African ancestry alive today carries on average somewhere between 1 and 2% Neanderthal ancestry in their genome, A startling fact that means the Neanderthals did not simply vanish so much as they were, in a very real biological sense, partially absorbed into the population that continued onward. At the same time, evidence suggests Neanderthal populations were already small and increasingly fragmented, well before modern humans arrived in significant numbers in some regions. Isolated groups vulnerable to the same climate instability, the same runs of bad luck across a few consecutive hard winters that had tested every human population across this entire era. Competition for the same limited resources, a slightly slower reproductive rate, small founding populations with less genetic resilience to absorb sudden losses, all likely played some role alongside whatever direct contact and at times conflict occurred between the two peoples. Is it fair then to call this an extinction at all when so much of what made the Neanderthals who they were persists quietly inside the bodies of people alive today? It is one of the questions this particular chapter of prehistory never quite lets a careful person settle comfortably, and perhaps it should not be settled too neatly. What can be said is that by roughly 40,000 years ago, the last confirmed Neanderthal sites, including one at Gorham's Cave on the remote southern tip of what is now Gibraltar, show human occupation trailing into apparent silence, the final flicker of an entire branch of humanity that had walked the earth successfully for well over 100,000 years longer, in fact, than modern humans had existed as a species, when that flicker finally went dark. For the modern human populations who remained spread thin across a hostile ice-bound world, this era demanded a particular kind of endurance that went beyond mere physical survival. It asked something of memory and imagination as well, the capacity to picture a future worth reaching toward even while crouched in near darkness deep inside a cave wall, painting an animal that might never be seen again by anyone who was not also willing to make that same difficult crawl through the dark to find it. Somewhere in that combination, endurance paired with imagination, cooperation paired with a stubborn reach toward meaning, lay whatever quality allowed one branch of humanity to keep walking forward through the coldest, hardest stretch of the entire Ice Age, while another branch, no less capable in so many ways, quietly reached the end of its own long road. The ice would not hold its grip on the world forever, though nobody living through its harshest years could have known that with any confidence. And when it finally slowly began to loosen the changes it set in motion, would ask something entirely new of the people who had survived to see it. A shift not of cold but of abundance, and abundance, as it would turn out, could reshape a way of life just as thoroughly as scarcity ever had. There is a number that tends to stop people cold the first time they encounter it, and it belongs here at the centre of this story because everything we have walked through so far, the migrations, the art, the mammoth, bone shelters, all of it happened inside lives that were by any modern measure extraordinarily fragile. Paleodemographers, researchers who study the age and health patterns preserved in ancient skeletal remains, have pieced together a picture of these hunter-gatherer populations that is sobering in its particulars, even if the broad outline was already something most of us sensed. Across many well-studied prehistoric sites, something close to a third to nearly half of all children did not survive to see adulthood. Not because parents failed to care for them, but because a world without antibiotics, without any real understanding of infection, without reliable shelter from extreme cold, simply offered no margin for error to a small body. It helps, before going further, to say clearly what this figure does and does not mean, because it is often misunderstood. A high rate of childhood death drags average life expectancy at birth down dramatically, sometimes into the 20s or low 30s in the raw statistics researchers calculate. But that number on its own paints a misleading picture of what an individual life actually looked like. A person who survived the dangerous early years of childhood, who made it past the particular vulnerabilities of infancy and early illness, stood a real chance of reaching what we would recognize as a full adult life sometimes into their 50s or beyond. The brutal arithmetic of this era was front-loaded. The danger was steepest at the very beginning of life, and for those who cleared that first difficult passage, the years that followed, while never easy, were not necessarily short. This matters enormously for how we understand the people at the center of tonight's story, because it means these communities were not populated primarily by the young cut down early and universally as the raw averages might suggest to someone hearing them for the first time. They held grandparents, they held elders whose accumulated knowledge, as we have already seen, functioned as the only library this world possessed. And the presence of those elders appears in the research of recent decades to have mattered more than survival statistics alone can capture. A theory sometimes called the grandmother hypothesis, developed by researchers studying both the fossil record and modern hunter-gatherer societies, proposes that the presence of post-reproductive women within a group women, no longer bearing children of their own but still strong enough to gather food, to teach, to hold and care for grandchildren, measurably improve the survival odds of the youngest members of the community. A grandmother in this reading was not a burden on a group's limited resources. She was one of its most valuable assets, and her presence may have helped shape one of the more distinctive features of human biology altogether: the unusually long post-menopausal lifespan our species has relative to most other primates. None of this softens the harder truths of daily survival in this world, and it would be dishonest to let it. The skeletal remains recovered from Ice Age and early post-Ice Age sites carry a written record of hardship etched directly into bone, visible to researchers even today. Faint horizontal lines in the enamel of ancient teeth, called Harris lines, mark moments when a child's growth briefly stopped and then resumed, a physical signature left behind by episodes of serious illness or prolonged hunger during childhood. Many recovered skeletons examined by osteoarchaeologists studying this era show evidence of these growth interruptions occurring more than once across a single short lifetime. A quiet record of repeated crisis survived at least for a while. Arthritis appears at ages that would surprise a modern observer, the wear of joints ground down by decades of walking long distances, carrying heavy loads and processing hides and plant material by hand, work that left its mark on the body well before what we would now consider old age. And then there is the harder question, the one many people are surprised to learn the evidence speaks to at all, which is violence between human beings themselves. For a long stretch of the 20th century, a somewhat romantic assumption took hold in parts of popular culture: the idea that hunter-gatherer societies unburdened by property borders or the pressures of dense settled living were largely peaceful, and that organized violence between groups was a much later invention, born alongside farming ownership and the first stirrings of hierarchy. The archaeological evidence gathered in more recent decades complicates that comforting picture considerably. At a site called Naturuk near the shores of what is now Lake Turkana in Kenya, researchers uncovered the remains of at least 27 individuals dated to roughly 10,000 years ago, showing injuries that are difficult to explain as anything other than deliberate violence. Several skulls show blunt force trauma consistent with clubs. One skeleton was found with what appears to be a stone projectile point still lodged inside the skull itself. The bodies were not buried with the careful ritual we see at other sites from this era. They were left where they fell near the edge of what was then a freshwater lagoon. Scholars still debate exactly what this scene represents. Some researchers argue Naturuk offers the earliest solid physical evidence of something resembling organized warfare between distinct groups, a violent conflict likely tied to competition over the increasingly scarce resources of a landscape undergoing its own climate stress at the time. Others urge more caution, suggesting the evidence, while clearly showing violence, may not necessarily prove the kind of sustained, organized intergroup conflict the word warfare tends to imply to modern ears, and could instead reflect a single, brutal, isolated episode rather than an established pattern of life. The truth, as is so often the case with evidence, this old likely sits somewhere the current record cannot yet fully resolve, and honest researchers continue to hold the question open rather than force it toward a tidy answer either way. What can be said with more confidence drawing from a wider body of evidence across many prehistoric sites beyond Naturuk alone is that interpersonal violence, though almost certainly less common and less organized than in later, more densely populated societies, was nonetheless a real and present danger within this world. Healed fractures on forearm bones, a pattern researchers sometimes associate with the defensive posture of someone raising an arm to block a blow, appear at a number of sites across this era. So do skull injuries that healed evidence not of murder but of violence survived individuals who were struck hard enough to fracture a bone and lived long enough afterward for that bone to knit itself back together. It is worth sitting for a moment with what that healing actually implies because it complicates any simple story about brutality alone. A person with a serious head injury in a world with no medicine as we understand it today does not typically recover well enough for bone to remodel around a healed fracture without some period of care from others, protection from further danger, food brought to them while they could not gather it themselves, warmth maintained while they could not tend a fire on their own. The very evidence of violence in the skeletal record sits right alongside evidence of its opposite. At Shanidar Cave in what is now northern Iraq, researchers examining the remains of an older Neanderthal man, one who lived with a withered arm, evidence of a healed skull fracture and signs of significant hearing loss. All injuries or conditions that would have made him a poor hunter and a genuine liability by any purely practical calculation found that he nonetheless survived for years after these injuries occurred, well into what would have counted as old age for his time. Someone, or more likely a whole community over an extended period, chose to keep him alive. Is it strange then that a world capable of the violence recorded at Naturuk was also apparently a world capable of this kind of sustained patient care for someone who could offer little in return? Perhaps it should not be so strange after all. Both truths sit inside the same species, inside very likely many of the same communities, because scarcity does not produce a single uniform response in human beings. It produces both the sharpened edge of competition when resources run thin enough, and the deep, stubborn loyalty of people who have learned across countless hard years that abandoning the vulnerable among them today might easily be their own fate tomorrow. There is one more kind of evidence from this era that reveals something the bones alone, damaged or healed, cannot fully convey, and it comes from how these people treated their dead. At a site called Sunghir in what is now Russia, dated to roughly 34,000 years ago, archaeologists uncovered the burial of two children likely no older than 10 and 13 years laid head-to-head in a single grave. Their bodies were covered in an almost unimaginable wealth of ornamentation for a world with no metalworking and no permanent settlements at all. More than 10,000 carefully carved ivory beads between them, along with spears crafted from straightened mammoth tusk. A technically demanding and time-consuming process, even by modern craft standards. Researchers estimate that producing that quantity of beadwork alone would have required many thousands of hours of skilled labour, likely contributed across a considerable span of time by multiple members of the wider community, not simply by grieving parents alone. What makes this burial especially striking is a detail visible directly in the bones of one of the two children, evidence of a significant physical disability likely present from birth. In many difficult resource, scarce environments throughout history, such a condition might reasonably be expected to correlate with a lower social status, not a higher one. Sunghir suggests something else entirely was happening in at least this particular community. The evidence remains open to some interpretation, and researchers continue to discuss exactly what these burials tell us about status inheritance and belief in this era. But the most widely favoured reading among those who study the site closely is that this level of ornamentation reflects inherited status, prestige that belonged to a family or lineage rather than something earned individually through a lifetime of hunting skill or physical strength. If that reading holds, it would push the origins of hereditary social standing, the idea that who your parents were could matter more than what you yourself had accomplished, back tens of thousands of years earlier than many researchers once assumed such distinctions could have existed at all. Taken together, the evidence from sites like Nataruk, Shanidar and Sungheir resists any single tidy conclusion about what daily existence in this world truly felt like, and that resistance is itself the most honest thing that can be said about it. It was a world capable of real cruelty where violence between human groups was neither unknown nor evidently entirely rare. It was equally a world capable of extraordinary tenderness, where an injured elder could be kept alive for years past the point of practical usefulness, and where a child born with a body the world might have dismissed could apparently be buried with more care and craftsmanship than most people across the whole of human history would ever receive. The people who lived through those 250,000 years were not simple, and they were not singular in character. They were in the fullest and most complicated sense of the word human, carrying inside them the same full range of cruelty and devotion that every generation since has carried in turn. All of this, the healed bones, the buried children, the mass grave beside a vanished lake, exists for us today only because the physical world happened to preserve it in soil, in ice, in the quiet chemistry of ancient bone. And that raises its own quiet question worth carrying forward from here, about how fragile and how remarkable it is that any of this evidence survived at all, and what the particular science of finding and reading it can and cannot. Still, everything told so far tonight rests on a quiet kind of detective work, and it deserves a closer look because the story of how researchers actually know any of this is almost as remarkable as the story those methods have uncovered. For a very long time, the primary tools available to anyone studying this era were the tools of traditional archaeology: a trowel, a careful eye, a patient hand brushing sediment away from a bone or a stone flake one layer at a time. Radiocarbon dating, developed in the middle of the 20th century, gave researchers their first reliable way to attach an approximate age to organic material, but it carries a hard limit that surprises many people when they first learn of it. Beyond roughly 50,000 years, the radioactive carbon isotope the method depends on has decayed to such a faint trace that the technique simply stops working with any real precision. For nearly the entire span of the story told across this video, radiocarbon dating is not usable at all, which meant researchers studying the deepest reaches of this era had to rely on entirely different methods: uranium series dating, which measures the slow radioactive decay of uranium trapped inside stalagmites and cave formations, and thermoluminescence, which measures the faint light released when certain minerals, buried and shielded from sunlight for tens of thousands of years, are finally heated in a laboratory, a kind of light that reveals indirectly how long ago that mineral was last exposed to the sun. What has genuinely transformed this field within the working lifetime of many researchers still active today, however, is not a new way of measuring age, but an entirely new category of evidence altogether, one that did not meaningfully exist as a practical tool until the final years of the last century. Ancient deoxyribonucleic acid, the molecule that carries genetic instruction inside every living cell, can, under the right conditions, survive inside bone and tooth for tens of thousands of years, fragmented and degraded, but not entirely destroyed. Extracting and reading that fragile genetic material required decades of careful, often frustrating technical development, much of it led by a small community of researchers working meticulously to avoid contaminating ancient samples with modern deoxyribonucleic acid from their own skin or breath. A problem serious enough that early results in this field were for some years treated with real skepticism until methods improved. The payoff once those methods matured has been extraordinary. In 2010, researchers sequencing a fragment of finger bone recovered from a cave in Siberia announced something that reshaped the entire picture of this era almost overnight: the genetic confirmation of an entirely new branch of ancient humanity. The Denisovans, known until that point from nothing more than that single finger bone and a couple of isolated teeth, too fragmentary to have ever been formally recognized through traditional skeletal analysis alone. Deoxyribonucleic acid succeeded where bone alone could not, revealing a lost population invisible to every prior method available to researchers. And the story does not end there, because in more recent years an even stranger technique has opened an entirely new window into this world, one that does not require finding a single bone at all. Researchers have developed methods sensitive enough to extract usable ancient deoxyribonucleic acid skull directly from cave floor sediment itself, genetic material shed from skin, from bodily fluid, from decomposed tissue, settled quietly into dirt and preserved there for tens of thousands of years without ever leaving behind a single identifiable bone fragment. Using this technique at Denisova Cave, the very site where that original finger bone was found, researchers have detected the genetic signature of human presence in sediment layers where no fossil remains exist at all, effectively proving that people, and in some layers multiple distinct populations of ancient humans, were present in a location the traditional fossil record alone would have shown as entirely empty. It is a genuinely strange thing to consider that dirt itself, ordinary-looking cave sediment that generations of earlier archaeologists would have simply cleared away in their search for bones and tools, has turned out to be its own kind of archive holding traces of people who left behind no other physical evidence of ever having been there at all. This same genetic revolution has reshaped how researchers understand something as fundamental as diet and daily health during this era, through a source that might seem at first almost too small to matter: the hardened dental plaque called calculus that builds up on ancient teeth over a lifetime, and unlike softer tissue survives remarkably well across tens of thousands of years. Trapped inside that calculus, researchers have identified microscopic starch granules revealing exactly which plants a person was eating. Fragments of ancient bacterial deoxyribonucleic acid revealing infections a person suffered from, and even traces suggesting the deliberate use of certain plants for what appears to be medicinal purposes. Evidence found in Neanderthal remains at one site in Spain, where calculus preserved compounds consistent with a natural pain reliever, alongside evidence the individual was likely suffering from a dental abscess at the time. A small, startlingly intimate glimpse into one person's private discomfort, tens of thousands of years removed from anyone who might have once cared whether it eased at all. Stable isotope analysis offers another quiet window into these lives, working on a principle that is almost poetic once explained plainly. The particular ratios of certain chemical elements, carbon and nitrogen, especially found in ancient bone collagen, shift in predictable, measurable ways depending on what kind of food a person ate across the final years of their life, whether their diet leaned heavily on meat or on plants, whether that meat came primarily from land animals or from marine sources like fish and shellfish. In effect, bone quietly records a rough average of what a person consumed, a kind of chemical diary, written without any intention of ever being read, waiting patiently across tens of thousands of years for a laboratory instrument sensitive enough to finally decode it. None of these remarkable techniques, though, changes an underlying limitation that any honest researcher working in this field will readily acknowledge, which is that the physical record of this era is a profoundly incomplete archive shaped as much by the accidents of preservation as by anything about the lives actually lived. Bone survives far better in certain soil chemistries than others, meaning entire populations who happen to live and die on acidic soil, which dissolves bone relatively quickly, may be almost invisible to researchers today compared to populations who happen to settle in more alkaline, bone-preserving conditions, an accident of geology with no relationship whatsoever to how large, sophisticated, or successful this population actually was. Coastal populations quite possibly among the most consistently successful and populous groups across this entire era, given the reliable food sources a shoreline can offer, are particularly underrepresented in what has survived for a specific and sobering reason already touched on earlier in this story. So much of the coastline these populations would have inhabited during the depths of the Ice Age now sits permanently submerged beneath rising post-glacial seas, an entire layer of potential evidence resting somewhere on the ocean floor almost certainly beyond any realistic hope of full recovery. Given all of this, how confident should we really be in the picture this evidence paints? It is a fair question, and the honest answer researchers in this field tend to give is a careful, qualified confidence strong enough to support the broad outline of the story told across this video, with real assurance the migrations, the climate pressures, the genetic bottlenecks, the deep antiquity of symbolic thought, while remaining genuinely humble about the finer details, the exact population numbers, the precise timing of individual events, the full diversity of ways of life that likely existed but left no surviving trace at all. Mainstream archaeology and genetics point strongly toward the narrative walked through. So far tonight, though the picture as researchers in this field will readily admit themselves is not yet complete and very likely never fully will be. What makes this ongoing detective work particularly alive rather than settled and finished is how frequently new techniques continue to overturn assumptions that once seemed reasonably secure. Every few years brings some new refinement, a more sensitive genetic sequencing method, a newly discovered cave, a fresh reanalysis of bones sitting in a museum drawer for decades unexamined by the tools that only recently became sensitive enough to read what they were quietly holding all along. It's worth remembering as we move forward from here that the picture offered across this story represents our best current understanding carefully built from real physical evidence, and not a finished, unchangeable truth carved permanently into stone. And it is precisely because so many different lines of evidence, bone chemistry, ancient genetics, sediment analysis, careful excavation do not always agree cleanly with one another, that some of the most interesting and genuinely unresolved debates in this entire field remain very much alive today. Debates among serious, careful researchers who look at the same fragments of evidence and arrive quite honestly at meaningfully different conclusions about what they mean. Tell us about the people who left it behind. Everything told so far tonight rests on a quiet kind of detective work, and it deserves a closer look because the story of how researchers actually know any of this is almost as remarkable as the story those methods have uncovered. For a very long time, the primary tools available to anyone studying this era were the tools of traditional archaeology: a trowel, a careful eye, a patient hand brushing sediment away from a bone or a stone flake one layer at a time. Radiocarbon dating, developed in the middle of the 20th century, gave researchers their first reliable way to attach an approximate age to organic material, but it carries a hard limit that surprises many people when they first learn of it. Beyond roughly 50,000 years, the radioactive carbon isotope the method depends on has decayed to such a faint trace that the technique simply stops working with any real precision. For nearly the entire span of the story told across this video, radiocarbon dating is not usable at all, which meant researchers studying the deepest reaches of this era had to rely on entirely different methods: uranium series dating, which measures the slow radioactive decay of uranium trapped inside stalagmites and cave formations, and thermoluminescence, which measures the faint light released when certain minerals, buried and shielded from sunlight for tens of thousands of years, are finally heated in a laboratory, a kind of light that reveals indirectly how long ago that mineral was last exposed to the sun. What has genuinely transformed this field within the working lifetime of many researchers still active today, however, is not a new way of measuring age, but an entirely new category of evidence altogether, one that did not meaningfully exist as a practical tool until the final years of the last century. Ancient deoxyribonucleic acid, the molecule that carries genetic instruction inside every living cell, can, under the right conditions, survive inside bone and tooth for tens of thousands of years, fragmented and degraded, but not entirely destroyed. Extracting and reading that fragile genetic material required decades of careful, often frustrating technical development, much of it led by a small community of researchers working meticulously to avoid contaminating ancient samples with modern deoxyribonucleic acid from their own skin or breath. A problem serious enough that early results in this field were for some years treated with real skepticism until methods improved. The payoff once those methods matured has been extraordinary. In 2010, researchers sequencing a fragment of finger bone recovered from a cave in Siberia announced something that reshaped the entire picture of this era. Almost overnight, the genetic confirmation of an entirely new branch of ancient humanity. The Denisovans, known until that point from nothing more than that single finger bone and a couple of isolated teeth, too fragmentary to have ever been formally recognized through traditional skeletal analysis alone. Deoxyribonucleic acid succeeded where bone alone could not, revealing a lost population invisible to every prior method available to researchers. And the story does not end there, because in more recent years an even stranger technique has opened an entirely new window into this world, one that does not require finding a single bone at all. Researchers have developed methods sensitive enough to extract usable ancient deoxyribonucleic acid directly from cave floor sediment itself, genetic material shed from skin, from bodily fluid, from decomposed tissue, settled quietly into dirt and preserved there for tens of thousands of years without ever leaving behind a single identifiable bone fragment. Using this technique at Denisova Cave, the very site where that original finger bone was found, researchers have detected the genetic signature of human presence in sediment layers where no fossil remains exist at all, effectively proving that people, and in some layers multiple distinct populations of ancient humans, were present in a location the traditional fossil record alone would have shown as entirely empty. It is a genuinely strange thing to consider that dirt itself, ordinary-looking cave sediment that generations of earlier archaeologists would have simply cleared away in their search for bones and tools, has turned out to be its own kind of archive, holding traces of people who left behind no other physical evidence of ever having been there at all. This same genetic revolution has reshaped how researchers understand something as fundamental as diet and daily health during this era, through a source that might seem at first almost too small to matter: the hardened dental plaque called calculus that builds up on ancient teeth over a lifetime. And unlike softer tissue, survives remarkably well across tens of thousands of years. Trapped inside that calculus, researchers have identified microscopic starch granules revealing exactly which plants a person was eating, fragments of ancient bacterial deoxyribonucleic acid, revealing infections a person suffered from, and even traces suggesting the deliberate use of certain plants for what appears to be medicinal purposes. Evidence found in Neanderthal remains at one site in Spain, where calculus preserved compounds consistent with a natural pain reliever, alongside evidence the individual was likely suffering from a dental abscess at the time. A small, startlingly intimate glimpse into one person's private discomforts, tens of thousands of years removed from anyone who might have once cared whether it eased at all. Stable isotope analysis offers another quiet window into these lives, working on a principle that is almost poetic once explained plainly. The particular ratios of certain chemical elements, carbon and nitrogen especially found in ancient bone collagen, shift in predictable, measurable ways depending on what kind of food a person ate across the final years of their life, whether their diet leaned heavily on meat or on plants, whether that meat came primarily from land animals or from marine sources like fish and shellfish. In effect, bone quietly records a rough average of what a person consumed, a kind of chemical diary written without any intention of ever being read, waiting patiently across tens of thousands of years for a laboratory instrument sensitive enough to finally decode it. None of these remarkable techniques, though, changes an underlying limitation that any honest researcher working in this field will readily acknowledge, which is that the physical record of this era is a profoundly incomplete archive, shaped as much by the accidents of preservation as by anything about the lives actually lived. Bone survives far better into certain soil chemistries than others, meaning entire populations who happen to live and die on acidic soil, which dissolves bone relatively quickly, may be almost invisible to researchers today compared to populations who happen to settle in more alkaline bone-preserving conditions, an accident of geology with no relationship whatsoever to how large, sophisticated or successful either population actually was. Coastal populations quite possibly among the most consistently successful and populous groups across this entire era, given the reliable food sources a shoreline can offer, are particularly underrepresented in what has survived for a specific and sobering reason already touched on earlier in this story. So much of the coastline these populations would have inhabited during the depths of the Ice Age now sits permanently submerged beneath rising post-glacial seas, an entire layer of potential evidence resting somewhere on the ocean floor, almost certainly beyond any realistic hope of full recovery. Given all of this, how confident should we really be in the picture this evidence paints? It is a fair question, and the honest answer researchers in this field tend to give is a careful, qualified confidence, strong enough to support the broad outline of the story told across this video. With real assurance, the migrations, the climate pressures, the genetic bottlenecks, the deep antiquity of symbolic thought, while remaining genuinely humble about the finer details, the exact population numbers, the precise timing of individual events, the full diversity of ways of life that likely existed, but left no surviving trace at all. Mainstream archaeology and genetics point strongly toward the narrative walked through. So far tonight, though, the picture as researchers in this field will readily admit themselves is not yet complete and very likely never fully will be. What makes this ongoing detective work particularly alive rather than settled and finished is how frequently new techniques continue to overturn assumptions that once seemed reasonably secure. Every few years brings some new refinement, a more sensitive genetic sequencing method, a newly discovered cave, a fresh reanalysis of bones sitting in a museum drawer for decades unexamined by the tools that only recently became sensitive enough to read what they were quietly holding all along. It's worth remembering as we move forward from here that the picture offered across this story represents our best current understanding, carefully built from real physical evidence, and not a finished, unchangeable truth carved permanently into stone. And it is precisely because so many different lines of evidence, bone chemistry, ancient genetic sediment analysis, careful excavation do not always agree cleanly with one another, that some of the most interesting and genuinely unresolved debates in this entire field remain very much alive today. Debates among serious, careful researchers who look at the same fragments of evidence and arrive quite honestly at meaningfully different conclusions about what they mean. Every story this deep in time is in a sense an argument still being had, and it would be a disservice to the honesty this channel promises to smooth over how much genuine disagreement still exists among the very researchers who've devoted their careers to piecing this era together. So it is worth pausing before moving forward to sit inside a few of those disagreements directly, not to resolve them because they cannot yet be resolved, but to understand why serious, careful people looking at the same evidence sometimes arrive at meaningfully different conclusions about what our ancestors actually were. The oldest, and in some ways still the deepest of these debates, concerns a question that sounds almost embarrassingly basic once stated plainly. Where exactly did modern humans come from, and how many times did it happen? For much of the 20th century, a considerable number of researchers favoured what became known as the multi-regional model, the idea that Homo erectus populations having spread across Africa, Asia, and parts of Europe hundreds of thousands of years earlier, evolved gradually and more or less in parallel into modern humans across all these regions, with enough ongoing contact and interbreeding between neighbouring populations to keep the whole scattered species developing along broadly similar lines. Against this stood what became known as the recent African origin model, the view that modern humans evolved as a distinct population within Africa, relatively recently in evolutionary terms, and then expanded outward, largely replacing older human populations they encountered elsewhere rather than blending gradually with them. For a long stretch of the 1990s and 2000s, genetic evidence appeared to settle this question fairly decisively in favour of the African origin model, and for good reason. Mitochondrial deoxyribonucleic acid passed down only through the maternal line, and Y chromosome deoxyribonucleic acid passed down only through the paternal line, both traced back when researchers built out their family trees across thousands of living people to relatively recent common ancestors living in Africa, seemingly ruling out any deep ancient parallel development happening simultaneously on other continents. The discovery of Neanderthal and Denisovan deoxyribonucleic acid inside modern human genomes, however, has complicated even this seemingly settled picture in a way that would have surprised many researchers working confidently within the African origin framework only 20 years ago. If modern humans expanding out of Africa interbred meaningfully with older populations already established elsewhere, then the truth sits somewhere between the two original camps. A primarily African origin, yes, but not the clean total replacement. Some early versions of that model assumed rather a spreading population that absorbed and was subtly reshaped by the older human lineages it encountered along the way. Most researchers today describe the current consensus using language considerably more careful than either original camp claimed for itself, something closer to mostly out of Africa with meaningful admixture, an academic phrase that quietly represents decades of genuinely difficult, hard-fought scientific revision. A newer and considerably more unsettled debate has emerged only within the last several years, and it concerns a discovery already mentioned earlier. In this story, the small-bodied, small-brained human relative called Homo naledi, found deep within the Rising Star cave system in South Africa. In 2023, the research team behind that discovery published findings claiming something genuinely startling, evidence suggesting Homo naledi may have deliberately buried its dead in shallow graves within the cave system, and more remarkably still evidence of what the team interpreted as deliberately engraved geometric patterns on the cave walls nearby, dated to roughly 240,000 years ago. If accurate, this would represent symbolic behaviour and mortuary practice from a human species with a brain roughly one-third the size of a modern human's, a species many researchers had long assumed lacked the cognitive sophistication for anything resembling deliberate burial or abstract mark-making at all. The response from the wider research community has been sharply openly divided, and it is worth saying plainly that this particular debate remains genuinely unresolved, rather than simply awaiting confirmation. Critics have raised serious methodological concerns questioning whether the burial claims meet the rigorous evidentiary standard the field typically requires before accepting something as significant as intentional burial, noting that sediment can shift and settle in ways that mimic a dug grave without one ever having existed, and that the dating of the wall engravings relative to the surrounding cave floor has not yet been established with full confidence. Supporters of the original claims argue The critics are applying an unusually harsh standard, one not always demanded with equal rigour of similar claims made about modern human sites, and that skepticism toward findings which challenge assumptions about brain size and cognitive capacity may itself reflect a bias worth examining honestly. As of now, this remains an open argument playing out in academic journals and conferences, rather than a settled fact, and it may take years of additional excavation and analysis before anything close to consensus emerges, if it ever fully does. There is a gentler question sitting underneath this particular controversy, though one that does not require Homo naledi's claims to hold up in order to matter, and it concerns what cognitive sophistication itself actually requires. For much of the 20th century, a hypothesis sometimes called the human revolution model, developed most influentially by researchers including Richard Klein, proposed something close to a single dramatic turning point, occurring somewhere around 50,000 years ago, when a genetic mutation or similar sudden change supposedly unlocked fully modern language, symbolic thought and behavioral sophistication in one relatively rapid transition, explaining the apparent burst of art, technology and complexity that becomes so visible in the archaeological record from that period onward. This tidy story of a single switch flipping has not held up especially well against the accumulating evidence gathered since it was first proposed, and the researchers Sally McBrearty and Alison Brooks, publishing an influential and widely cited paper in 2000, argued for a considerably different, more gradual picture instead. Drawing on evidence stretching back, as we have already walked through together tonight, to the ochre engravings and shell beads at Blombos, some 70,000 years before the supposed revolution, the heat-treated stone tools, the early hints of long-distance exchange networks. They argued that modern human behaviour did not arrive in a single dramatic burst at all, but accumulated slowly, unevenly in fits and starts across tens of thousands of years, with different innovations appearing in different regions at different times, sometimes disappearing again for reasons still not fully understood, long before anything resembling a single decisive threshold was crossed. Most researchers working in this field today lean considerably more toward this gradual accumulating picture than toward the older, more dramatic single revolution model, though pockets of genuine disagreement about the pace and shape of that accumulation persist even now. Why does this particular disagreement matter so much to people who study it so carefully? Perhaps because it touches something larger than any single dig site or dated artifact. A question about what it actually means to become fully human in the first place. Whether that transformation was a door that opened suddenly, or a threshold worn down slowly by footsteps, and over across an almost unimaginable span of ordinary days. A final area of real active disagreement concerns the interbreeding itself, the meeting points between modern humans and the Neanderthal and Denisovan populations already discussed across this story. Genetic evidence clearly shows that this interbreeding happened, but exactly how many separate occasions it occurred, in which regions, and involving how many individuals remains considerably less settled than popular summaries sometimes suggest. Certain populations in Melanesia today carry Denisovan ancestry as high as 4 to 6% of their genome, considerably more than the Neanderthal ancestry found in most European or Asian populations. A pattern that has led some researchers to propose multiple geographically separate interbreeding events with genetically distinct Denisovan populations rather than one single contact point. Though the fragmentary nature of the Denisovan fossil record, still limited to a small handful of bone and tooth fragments, even now makes this particular question especially difficult to resolve with full confidence. The evidence remains incomplete enough that mapping the full true shape of these ancient encounters, how many times different human populations met, mingled, and separated again across this vast stretch of time and geography may remain at least partially out of reach for a long while.